Hey people, what's up? Alright, in this video we're going to take a closer look at the elements of art. Now, I know we've talked a little bit about this in class, but we've never really gotten that deep into it. And even though you might be able to list off all 7 elements, I really want you to have a better understanding of how the elements of art are used in some of the artworks that we're looking at, as well as in our own art making practice. So to begin, let's take a look at line. Now, you may have heard the quote from Paul Klee that a line is a dot that's gone for a walk, and for the most part, that's true. A line is basically any mark between 2 points, and that can come in a wide range of shapes, in different sizes, going different directions, has different line qualities and line characteristics. So different that sometimes we don't recognize what we're looking at as being a line. Now, in these paintings here from Barnett Newman, his use of line is very evident and very straightforward, using these traditional horizontal and vertical lines. In comparison to this painting, the use of line is very different. Now, if you stop and think about what we're looking at, it makes sense. This rocky edge in the background, going in this downward direction, is creating this bold diagonal line that leads the viewer's attention right towards the main subject that the artist wants to be emphasized. And I think that right there is probably one of the most important uses of line in art, is to lead the viewer's attention. You can see that again here in this painting, right? It's very evident in The Last Supper how the artist is using line to lead towards that subject. These open portals, I believe, on either side of the painting, they are all in line with one another, but with linear perspective, they're creating these 2 strong diagonal lines that go right towards the main subject. Now, anytime you're looking at an artwork, I want you guys to stop and think about how the artist is using line, right? And try to identify what types of lines you see. And maybe just make a list in your journal when you're kind of doing your own art analysis, all the different types of line that you can kind of pick out. Now, line can also be used to define shapes. And when we're talking about the lines that are kind of defining shapes, we're talking about contour lines. The lines that kind of go around the edge of what that shape is. Lines, as they're defining shapes, they're often either open or closed to create that shape. Open shapes, our eyes kind of fill in the gaps between. Just as in this painting here, our eyes kind of fill in the gaps and still follow that pathway. The same thing is happening with open shapes. Versus a closed shape, where this line is going around the whole edge, but it's enclosed in creating that entire shape. And that's kind of where, Paul Klee's quote of a line is a dot that's gone for a walk until it comes back on itself. Once a line closes back on itself, then we have a shape. So a dot makes a line makes a shape. So when we're talking about shape, we're typically talking about 2 types of shapes, geometric and organic, right? The main characteristic in a shape is that it's 2-dimensional. So all shapes are 2-dimensional. Keep that in mind. With geometric shapes, often what makes it geometric is that if you were to divide it in half, you have equal symmetry on either side. So you can imagine cutting a line right down the middle here, here, and here, we have symmetry. Same thing goes here. If you cut it at the right angle, you can create symmetry very easily. Also, with geometric shapes, it's typically easy to measure the angles. There's a formula involved that makes sense. Examples of geometric shape in artwork here, Pierre Mondrian's Broadway Boogie, using basic shape, these very geometric squares and rectangles, and he's creating the sensation of a busy New York street. Here in Pablo Picasso's artwork, he's using these geometric shapes in a little different way to break down the human form in that Cubist style. Now, in comparison, we have organic shapes. Now, organic shapes are what we would find in nature, whether that be a rock, a leaf, a cloud. Not so easy to measure, not so easy to describe, a little bit different. Now, organic shapes can be free of form, it can be very abstract, or just unidentifiable. Which one here is what you would call an organic shape? Ding, ding, ding. Hopefully you all pointed out Matisse's Blue Woman. All right. Form. So again, The way this progresses, the way I like to think that it progresses, if a dot makes a line and a line makes a shape, and a shape is two-dimensional, when you start to build on that shape, you create form, three-dimensional, right? So here we have the outline, the contour line of a cup, just the shape. But when you add depth to it, height, width, and depth, you create form. It's three-dimensional. Now, form refers to any three-dimension aspect in our artwork. It can be in sculpture, that's actually three-dimensional. You can kind of walk around it, you can put your hand through it, or just how it appears to be three-dimensional, whether that be a photograph or a drawing or a painting. Now, to create form out of shape, something that we want to be thinking about is the use of light and shadow, and how shadow creates the illusion of depth. And we'll get a little bit more into that in a moment. But first, let's take a look at color. Color can be quite complicated, and just kind of go over some of the basics here. Firstly, hue. You'll hear me use the word hue a lot in class. And what I'm talking about is just a pure color. So a pure blue hue, a pure red hue, pure orange hue, right? Now, when we start to change that hue by adding value, adding tints and shades, lights and darks, by adding black or white to that hue, then we're changing the value, the tone of that color. Now, as long as you're working in one color, let's say blue, and adding white as a tint or black as a shade, you're working in what's called a monochromatic palette. The saturation of a color is how strong that color is, right? How intense it is. The temperature of a color is often referring to its warmth or its coolness. And if you take a division of the color wheel here, right? If you divide it right in half, typically let's say right about, let's say here, yeah? On this side, we have much more cooler colors. On this side, we have much more warmer colors. Now the primary colors, the red, the yellow, and the blue, those are the colors that make up all other colors. No color can make those colors. You have to find them in pure form, or pure hue, but they will make up all other colors on the color wheel. You mix a red and blue together, you get a violet. You mix a red and yellow together, you get an orange. You mix a yellow and a blue together, you get a green. Your secondary colors. Your tertiary colors are when you mix one of your secondary, let's say a green, with one of your primary, your blue, and you get a blue-green. So that's what your tertiary colors are. Anytime you're mixing one primary, one secondary color. Complementary colors are colors that are opposite each other, the color wheel, like orange and blue. They're opposite each other. Now, typically, when we say complementary, we're not talking about how they complement each other, as in we're not talking about how they go well together. That's not necessarily the case. It depends on what you're trying to do as an artist. But complementary colors mean that they are opposite, and that when they're side by side, they are intense. They make each other appear as if they're popping off the canvas more. But as far as mixing them together, they don't work so well together depending on what you're trying to do. They neutralize one another. So if we mix a blue and an orange together, or a red and a green together, often what we get is a neutralized, dulled down color, usually a grays or browns. Now, harmonious colors are the colors that are side by side. Harmonious, they're much more peaceful, they're much more soft on the eye, they go well together, they're much more comfortable to look at. Now, value. Value is very important. Value is referring to the lightness or darkness in our artwork. It's what is used to make objects appear more real, because it's imitating the natural light. So it's really important when we're working with value in our artwork to think about where our light source is coming from. So if the light source is coming from this top left hand and is shining down on our orb, then our highlight, our brightest point, will be right there, right in the direction of that light. And that's going to be the lightest tone. The midtone, as it fades away from that light source, becomes a little bit darker. The darkest tone, kind of on the opposite side of that light source. And then we have our cast shadow over here on the surface, but then we have this bright or this lighter area right here, and that's the reflected light off the surface coming back at our object. Now, something about value I want you guys to be thinking about is value is what creates form, right? It's with value that we can take shape and make it into form. Here's some common ways of making value in drawing. We have hatching and cross-hatching, basically a series of parallel lines to make hatching. And when you cross that first series of parallel lines with another series of parallel lines, you get what's called cross-hatching. And we can see that throughout this drawing here. The more dense, the more tight our hatching is, or the more tight our cross-hatching is, the darker the tone. The more loose it is, the lighter our tone. And the lightest areas, the brightest areas, we have no hatching at all, showing those are what's our highlights. All right. So another way of making value is with stippling. Stippling is a series of dots upon dots upon dots to create value. You can see here, the tighter the dot, the closer it is together, the darker the tone. The further away, the lighter the tone, right? This painting here by Seurat, all this composed of colors of dots, just dabs of paint over and over again. This painting is quite large, and he didn't make nearly as many paintings. He only made a few, just the meticulous effort that it goes into creating artwork in this way. Pretty impressive. Another method, scribbling. Now, you may not think of scribbling as being a method of making art, but it absolutely is. In particular, making tone. And again, the tighter the weave of the lines, the darker the tone, right? The lighter the weave of the lines, the lighter the tone. Lastly, shading. Shading is a little bit different from the other three in that you don't see the use of line so evidently. Yeah? It's much softer, much more gradual. The positioning of the pencil in shading is a little bit different because you're not using the tip of the pencil, but you're using the side of the pencil to create that soft shading. Texture is another way of creating the illusion of form, right? So just like with the value, adding value to our objects, our shapes, we can create that illusion of form. Same thing applies for texture. Now, when we're talking about texture, we're talking about how something feels, right? And typically there's two types of texture: implied or optical texture, texture that you see and it might give the impression of a certain feeling, tactile feeling, but when you touch it, it's just not there. Versus real or tactile texture, which is actually physical, texture that you can actually feel. Here in these examples, we have optical texture, implied texture. We can see the furry softness of the animal's fur, or the smoothness in this hair, or the roughness of the rock wall. But we know if we touch it, of course, it's not going to feel the same way. In comparison to these images, with this wood material, if you were to actually touch this, it's going to feel the way you think it would, that rough, woody feel. Space, the final frontier, the last of the elements of art. Really interesting. Space is an element which all artworks contain. An artwork can't exist without using space. For one, all objects take up space. And when we're talking about it, space, what we're referring to is the area surrounding an object, above and below, as well as the area that's within an object. So when we're making artworks and we're using shapes and forms in our art, those are defined by the space around them. As well, the space that we want to create is defined by the objects we use, if you can follow that. they work together. The objects we are placing as well as the space that we were using, they work together in that. So there's three basic ways that we use to show space. There's a little bit more to it than this, but we're going to focus on just these three for the moment. Shallow and deep space. In this image in the top right here, we see this banana in front of the container that's in front of the cup. Not a whole lot going on. It's a very limited view for our eyes to kind of explore. In addition to that, the way the artist has drawn this with these walls on the side and this back wall, he's really enclosed the space, very shallow. Even adding further to that, this cast shadow being created, because you can tell that the light source is out here in the front, where we're sitting. Casting the shadow back really amplifies that limited space. In comparison to this image here, it's a much more open composition. We can see there's a lot more information going on, much deeper for our eyes to travel into the artwork. There's a clear foreground, midground, and then this background. And as our eyes explore further backwards, the objects start to get smaller, and you can really see that in these buildings up here as the buildings recede further away and the windows start to get smaller and more obscure, really creating that sense of deep space. Here we have positive versus negative space. Typically, positive space is just the area that an object contains, right? Versus negative space is the area that's surrounding that object or that's inside of that object, depending on its shape. Here, again, if we take an image and we turn it into a silhouette, just black and white, if it's a black image on a white picture plane, then the black is what is positive. If it's a white image on a black picture plane, now the white, the object, is now negative. It kind of appears like it's been cut out of this paper in a way. I don't always stick to the black and white positive negative, but you can kind of see how that would work. In this example here, overlapping space. Now, whenever we put an object in front of another object, blocking its view, it appears that that first object is closer to us. And it's very evident here. Between the fruit placed out front, you can see the cast shadow going back, nothing blocking it, and then the other fruit behind that further away, raised slightly up even. And then here, overlapping. The bread is clearly in front of the vase, or the water jug. The bottle is in front of these melons. So you can see that overlapping effect. And I just want to point something else out here really quick, as I just mentioned it. As objects go further away, they get higher in the picture plane, right? Something to do with linear perspective. We'll talk about that again later on. There's a lot more to space, but just a quick overview of some things to be thinking about. So I want you guys to be aware of these elements, right, and how you're using them in your artwork. All right, now why don't we take a look at a few artworks, and I want you guys to try and list off, identify what elements you see being used. Not just the elements you see, but also think about how the artist is using those elements. So to begin, what do we see here? What elements do you see being used? If you're going to look at line, how is line being used here? How would you describe the types of lines you see? What about the use of color? What's the dominant color in this image? Would you say it has more warm colors or more cool colors? Would you describe the colors as being harmonious or complementary? What do you think? What about space? Do you see any use of space here? How would you describe the space? And what has the artist done to create that space? Next image, take a look. How is the use of line different here than in the previous image? Is there any use of value in this image? What about texture? Do you see the artist using any texture at all in this image? How about this one? What is the dominant element that you see? What do you think? Line, shape, form, color, value, texture, space? What do you think? What is the dominant element here? How is the use of color different in this image than either of the previous two? How would you describe, or what do you think you see more of? Do you see more shapes or more form being used, if at all? What do you think? So this is just for your own practice, for you to kind of get a sense of how to look at artworks and things to be thinking about. I'll be posting some other information about a few of the elements for you to look at. But for right now, just be aware of what the 7 elements are, of course, and whenever you look at an artwork, what to be thinking about, how to analyze what you see, describing what you see. And then lastly, how do you want to use the elements in your artwork? How are you putting them all together? Remember, the elements of art are basically the building blocks for whatever it is we're going to create. So get out there, have some fun, you guys, and make more arts.